सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen though.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Before I set up this episode of Cut The Clutter, let me ask you a trick question. Actually, it looks like a very simple question. What is 1 plus 1 plus 1? Right? Simple answer. So wait for the answer. Meanwhile, you are also wondering where I am standing. I am holding a microphone with ThePrint brand. Unusual because usually I do it a lot more casually than this. I am in Bengaluru today. This episode is being recorded by my colleague and our Bengaluru, Karnataka correspondent Sharan Povana, whose brilliant work you've seen in the recent election campaign. So he's the one at the other end. Anything goes wrong with this recording, light, audio, noise, etc. Even if construction starts in the adjoining building, it's his fault. And this is being recorded at the Four Seasons in Bengaluru, courtesy of my old friend Ruben Kataria, who happens to be the general manager. Now that said, I've given you enough time. This has given you enough time to think about what is 1 plus 1 plus 1, right? What does it add up to? And you also know, I'd given you a hint in the beginning, that this is a trick question. Now 1 plus 1 plus 1 is 3, isn't it? Very simple. It can be people, 1 person, 2 persons, 3 persons, 3. Cricket, 1 run, 2 runs, 3 runs, 3. The Beatles sang famously in their number, come together, 1 and 1 and 1 is 3. So where is the question? Now, when it's 1 plus 1 plus 1, people 3. 1 plus 1 plus 1, runs in cricket 3. 1 plus 1 plus 1, countries, it is 3. 1 plus 1 plus 1, commodities, it is 3. But you know what? In one particular case, 1 plus 1 plus 1 becomes not 3 but 1. And that is when the prism through which you are looking at this is geostrategic or geopolitical. What do we mean by adding one country plus one country plus one country leading up to 1? These 3 countries are also in a way interconnected. They border each other. That is Pakistan next door to us, then China also next door to us, and then Russia a little bit away from Pakistan and us, but bordering China. So this is a trio of nations which are doing different things. 3 different things, trading in 3 different commodities. But all of this adds up to one strategic picture or one strategic idea. Now, what exactly is happening? The big headline that we've seen recently in our media, which has been noted greatly in the Indian media, is the fact that Pakistan has now started buying discounted Russian oil. So first of all, Russia is now doing Pakistan a favor by selling them discounted oil. This is the price at which Russia sells oil to the whole world. There is a price cap that's been fixed by Europeans, by the Western world. Buying Russian oil above which is a violation of sanctions, but below this, any country can buy. So India is negotiating, China has negotiated, Pakistan also has obviously negotiated. Now the bargain you drive below this threshold, below this peak or below this upper limit that's been set by the Western world, by the countries that have gotten together to impose sanctions, that is between you and the Russians. That's your bargaining skill. So Russians don't tell you the price, because if they tell you the price of what they are charging one country, then others get an idea and others start negotiating below that. Russians have a problem because they don't have that many buyers, because not that many countries want to buy Russian oil right now. So there's been China, the biggest buyer, India, the second biggest buyer, then comes Pakistan. In terms of what Pakistan's buying right now, the amounts are small compared to India. You will see a chart on your screens as I keep talking. That gives you an idea of the approximate annual import of crude oil by India compared to annual crude oil import by Pakistan. Also, approximate daily import by India of the total oil in barrels, crude oil in barrels, and by Pakistan, and also India's import from China in daily terms, in terms of barrels per day, and Pakistan. So you can see, if you see this data, it is evident that what Pakistan is buying is a fraction of what India buys. Pakistan's economy is about a tenth of India's. In fact, effectively today, given how much of a mess they are in, it is less. Pakistan's foreign exchange reserves are just over $4 billion. India's are inching on to $600 billion. So there is a big mismatch there. But the fact is that Pakistan has become another major country buying Russian oil. I'm not going further into details of how much Pakistan is buying, except to say that the currency in which Pakistan is paying is very interesting. They are paying the Russians in Chinese yuan. Now, Russians can't be paid in the dollar because that comes under the sanctions. And that is the problem India has paying for Russian crude, because India wants to pay with rupee. Russians keep saying, what do we do with this rupee? Because we have a humongous trade imbalance with India, particularly ever since India started importing so much oil from Russia. So now Russian-Indian trade has gone up to nearly $40 billion. Russia's imports from India are not just over, if at all, about 1/10 of that. So the rest is surplus money, and the Russians keep saying, Russian foreign minister has spoken about it, Russia's deputy prime minister spoke about it, Mantorov, who was in India, that we don't know what to do with this rupee. We wish we had more to buy from India. Pakistan has gotten around both problems. It's gotten around the dollar sanctions problem, also gotten around the problem where Russians won't know what to do with Pakistani rupee. In any case, nobody would want Pakistani rupee, given how unstable it is and how it's been falling. So Pakistan has got the Chinese yuan. Now, I have not been able to, whatever research I might have done, I also knocked at a few doors, I called a few people. I have not got a clear answer as to where Pakistan is getting this surplus yuans from, because with China, Pakistan also has a big trade imbalance, which means obviously deficit on its side. China runs a trade surplus almost with every major country that it trades with. So it can't be that Pakistan has a trade surplus in yuan with China. So it's possible, I'm guessing now, it's possible that Pakistan is converting its tiny reserves of the dollar into the Chinese yuan so they can pay the Russians, and Russians can use that money to shop in China. Why doesn't India do that? You can imagine, as a sovereign nation with so many problems with China, do we really want to convert our dollar reserves into yuan, into the Chinese currency, and use that as a convertible currency to trade with Russia? That is a big loss of face. That also, by the way, is an answer to those who fantasize about rupee in the very short run becoming an international or a global currency. There's a long, long way to go. The Pakistanis, however, are doing that. So once again, three countries involved: Russia, Pakistan the buyer, Russia the seller, and China the currency issuer, and maybe also giving loans to the Pakistanis to buy this. We don't know, which might be an indirect subsidy to the Russians. We don't know yet, so we can't speculate. But once again, 1 and 1 and 1 is not 3. 1 and 1 and 1 in this case is 1, because the three seem to be acting in concert. The second important thing is, look at what the Chinese are doing with liquefied natural gas. Now, for 6 months before the war started, in Ukraine, say from September in 2021 or a little bit before that, the Chinese started buying up liquefied natural gas for future supplies over the next 4 or 5 years, as if it was going out of fashion, as if soon enough there'll be no LNG left in the world. Now, this was not for supplies right away. The Chinese were booking supplies that were available in the world anywhere for the next 4 or 5 years. What that does is, directly and indirectly, it creates a scarcity in the market, and it also ups prices going ahead. And what were the Chinese doing? Chinese were not buying this in bulk. Chinese had more than a dozen companies which signed at least 22 different contracts, and each contract was kept a little bit small, whereby it flew under the radar and it wasn't caught by so many of the energy watchers across the country. What happened in the process was that the Chinese, in those 6 months between September 21 and February 22, when the war started, when the Russian invasion started, in that period, the Chinese companies, 11 companies, 10 of those are all fully state-owned companies. We don't know about the 11th, maybe indirectly state-owned. Those companies signed up to buy 91% of all LNG being sold in the world, all LNG being available. Now, did they buy this from Russia? They bought some from Russia, but they bought LNG available from anywhere for deliveries going ahead. They bought from the US, thank you very much. They bought from Qatar, and they bought from other countries. The nut graph of the story is that in these 6 months, Chinese and their companies bought up 91%, 91% of the global LNG supplies. By this time, the invasion had started and the world had woken up, and companies from across the world, governments from across the world got into a scramble for LNG, so the prices would have gone up. There was competition. Even then, in the following 6 months, Chinese kept on buying aggressively, and they bought 57% of all global supplies. So for a lot of this data and analysis, we have to thank two fine scholars. That is Stephen R. Miles and Gabriel B. Collins, both at Rice University's Center for Energy Studies. Both are fellows there. The first one, Stephen Miles, particularly specializes in global natural gas and energy transactions. And this is an article that they wrote. This is from an article that they wrote for Foreign Policy magazine. They are the ones we have to thank for all this data and deep analysis. So what they did was they looked at 600 discrete LNG transactions over the past 18 years to see if they were finding an unusual trend in these Chinese purchases. Because you know what? What are they after? And what is anybody after? And what are we after in this question? Anybody can buy. A country can anticipate there'll be some trouble, but when a country anticipates there might be trouble in a commodity, this commodity prices may go up, you don't buy 91% of it. You buy up that much if you know definitely that something's going to go wrong big time with this market. So the question then arises, did the Chinese know that Russia was going to invade Ukraine and a war were to begin, and accordingly there was going to be a crush on gas, particularly gas coming out of Russia. So buy up in advance because gas was going out of fashion, particularly for the Europeans, because 60% of the equivalent of 60% of the gas in the Nord Stream 1, the main pipeline that takes gas to Europe, the equivalent of that the Chinese had bought up already. And while the Chinese were buying this up, at the same time, Russians were reducing supply of gas through Nord Stream to Europe. So in the period that the Chinese bought up all this gas and booked all this gas, the Russians reduced their supplies to Europe by 40%. Russians kept on saying, we'll starve Europe for gas. And then, you know, Europe had to do many emergency things. Europe suffered. That was the punishment that Russia delivered on Europe, but that punishment would have been much less severe if the Chinese had not bought up all this gas and made gas scarce and more expensive all over the world. Americans also benefited from their buying. Qataris also benefited from their buying, but the fact is only one country hoarded all this gas. In fact, if you look at these researchers, they say, looking at the data, the available data, and data is available in China from 2006 onwards only, Generally, China's annual purchases are about 5 million metric tons. In this case, it went up by more than 4 times, 5 times. In fact, the highest amount the Chinese had ever bought in the past was 9.1 million metric tons, and that amounted then to 45.7% of global supplies. That was only in 1 year. This year, they bought 91% of global supplies, and even then on, continued buying. So once again, the question, did they know what was going to happen? So once again, one commodity, two countries, 1 plus 1 plus 1. Is it 3 or is it 1? So one country knew they were going to war. Did they tell the other they were going to war? Certainly, Putin told Xi Jinping something when they had their summit around the Winter Olympics time in China. And it's widely believed in the world that the Chinese knew that there was going to be an invasion, but requested the Russians to delay it until the Winter Olympic Games took place there. So if the Chinese knew it, did they take advantage of it and stock up all this gas? Which brings us to our third point and the third commodity. Third commodity is wheat. Gehu, wheat that goes into our rotis, right? Rotis, pasta, noodles, spaghetti, everything. Chow mein, everything. Now, wheat has been a little bit of a stressed commodity for the past couple of years in the world. Globally, the prices went up last year because war started in Ukraine. Ukraine and Russia are both among the biggest exporters of wheat in the world markets because they have surpluses. Last year, they had a war, and there was a period when ports out of Ukraine were blocked and they were not able to send their grain out, and there was a lot of grain rotting in their warehouses. Then Turkey brokered the deal between Russia, Ukraine through the UN, through which now grain can go out of Ukraine, and that sort of calmed down wheat prices. It was also the year that India had a stressed wheat output. It did not turn out to be as bad as was initially imagined, but still worse than anticipated, still worse than planned. Last year wasn't the best year for India for wheat, and that's the reason India also put a ban on wheat exports. Now, underlying that, something else was happening. Ultimately, Ukrainian wheat started coming out. India also allowed some wheat to be exported, particularly to African countries who depend on wheat imports. Otherwise they'll get into a big crisis. But the fact is that meanwhile, one country which is not even such a big wheat consumer, they are the biggest wheat producers in the world, but they are not the biggest wheat consumers in the world, that started stocking up whatever wheat was available in the world. And that country, you guessed it right, is China. So why were the Chinese buying up all this wheat? So once again, we found an article in producer.com by Sean Pratt. Producer.com is an agricultural commodities, agricultural business website that tells us that in 2022-23, and this data is then confirmed by all other sources, that in 22-23, China has become the biggest wheat importer in the world. So China has imported more than 12 million tons of wheat. Now, how much is 12 million tons? You might say, oh, India produces about 110 million tons. So what is 12 million tons? China produces about 130 million tons. What is 10 million tons? 10 billion tons, 12 million tons. So what is 12 million tons? 12 billion tons is a lot when it comes to global wheat exports. For example, for China, the Chinese have never imported this much wheat since 95-96. Then they imported 12.3 million tons of wheat. Why they imported it then, we don't know, right? But right now, are they stocking up wheat also as they are stocking up LNG because they see a global shortage coming up, because they see the war prolonging, and they know that the global wheat market depends so heavily on Ukrainian and Russian wheat surpluses? Would they have known? Now, this is a double conspiracy theory. Would anybody have known, if anybody had known, that the Nova Kakhovka dam will be blown up? Because that means flooding the richest wheat growing areas of Ukraine. And that is a terrible ecological disaster and agricultural disaster, and will have an overhang on the global food situation, particularly wheat and sunflower oil situation. If somebody knew that, it was a good idea to stock up on wheat. And so the Chinese have been buying up wheat wherever wheat was available. Now, the same analyst, Sean Pratt, tells us that in the past, the Chinese have not shown such alacrity to buy up wheat. In fact, under the WTO agreement, under something called tariff-related quotas or TRQs, Chinese are supposed to buy a certain amount of wheat, but they've not been doing so. In fact, the quota that they're supposed to buy every year is 9.64 million tons. They've not been buying it. They were taken to WTO arbitration by the Americans. The Chinese lost the case. That was the Chinese commitment. They've not been keeping it. But that began to change in 2020-21. From 2020-21, the Chinese began stocking up wheat. So the biggest grower of wheat in the world, which has traditionally been an exporter, started stocking up from any wheat it could find anywhere in the world. Now, by the end of this year, international estimates tell us that China's stocks of wheat in its godowns will be 140 million tons. That's more than China's entire production for the year. So after all the consumption, etc., they will still have that much left. That's because they're importing so much. Why do they need it? Again, this Chinese stockpile of 140 million tons in the year 22-23, which has just ended, in that year, this would amount to 53% of all global supplies. Now, we know that Egypt is traditionally the largest wheat importer, 11 million tons. Then you have Turkey, which is about 10.5 million tons, right? The Chinese have imported this year already more than them. So once again, a country, yet another commodity. So think now once again, and then add one and one and one. One country, Russia, China, Pakistan. 1 plus 1 and 1, 3 countries. 3 commodities, that is oil, LNG and wheat. And the only place where we fail the 3 example rule is the currencies. Because there is the yuan, the Chinese yuan, whether used by the Chinese or the Pakistanis, and the US dollar that the Chinese have used to buy up stock of wheat from everywhere and LNG from wherever possible. But you know what? Even the 2 currency thing could become 3 currency once we find out how the Pakistanis have paid for this yuan. So once again, add it all up. It looks like 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. But no, when you add it all up with a little bit of imagination, it's not a conspiracy theory. It will look like the geostrategic interests of Russia, China, or I should put China first. China, Russia and Pakistan in that order are now converging. So 1 plus 1 plus 1 is adding up to 1. And if you are not yet impressed, watch the statement that Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, made on the 75th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between Russia and Pakistan. He hailed the friendship, the quote-unquote friendship between 2 countries. He said, Pakistan-Roosi dosti zindabad. The fact is that Pakistan is a country with which Russia has been at war for a very long time, for the bulk of this 75-year history. For about 35 years, they were at war with Pakistan in terms of being adversaries in the Cold War, because Pakistan was a member of the American-led anti-communist, supposedly anti-communist security alliances, military alliances. They were actively members. And after that, for a full decade, the Soviet Union, the parent of Russia, was locked in a devastating war, devastating particularly for itself, a devastating war in Afghanistan, where the Pakistanis fought on the other side. Of course, it was a proxy war, but everybody knows, there is zero secret. Every child knows who were the antagonist nations in that war. And Pakistan was definitely on the other side. So when Lavrov now hails Rus-Pakistan dosti over 75 years, you know, in diplomacy, anybody can say anything. I said this to you earlier. The old saying goes, diplomats are sent abroad to lie for their countries.